Oh man, okay. When I think about these two teams and a defenseman trade, the big idea that pops into my mind right away is the Lane Hudson, Brett Kulak deal that went down all those years ago. And that's kind of the thing here. These teams don't trade with each other often, but when they do, they always get both fan bases riled up and ready to engage in online arguments, because today we are talking about the Montreal Canadiens and the Edmonton Oilers, and a post made on The Athletic by Alan Mitchell from July 29th. Take a look at this piece. Oilers trade targets 3 defensemen who could solve a major final roster issue. Now, The Athletic is paid for material. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read this yourself, and if you do have The Athletic, you will be free to do so. But because this is paid for material, instead we are going over onto donslescoulisses.com, because this piece made by Raphael Simard goes out there and talks about how Justin Barron was labeled as a person on this Athletic list. Now, Dans les Coulisses, of course, this is a secondary website. They don't publish the straight-up Athletic article word for word, but they do use some of the quotes from the Athletic piece and the main ideas as well, which I thought was interesting enough to explore in a video like this, which is why I'll leave a link in the description to both of the articles here. Dans les Coulisses is not behind a paywall, The Athletic is. Take a look at what Raphael Simard writes about. Justin Barron may have signed a 2-year deal, but shortly after signing the contract, he was linked to the Oilers. Yesterday, it was Oilers reporter Alan Mitchell who wrote about the subject in his 3 defense targets article. Edmonton needs help on the right side of defense, and Barron is one of the defensemen Stan Bowman could target. Rasmus Andersson and Artyom Zub are the other 2 defensemen that Alan Mitchell mentions. In the case of the Montreal Canadiens rear guard, he now has a contract, and his progression is worth the risk for the Oilers, according to the journalist. Alan Mitchell writes this, that Justin Barron is a long-term acquisition, but his speed and offensive tools make him a reasonable investment for a right-hander. In his piece, Mitchell writes that in order to get Zub from Ottawa, Philip Broberg would probably be asked for by the Senators, even though he is a left-hander. And later in his column, he wondered if a Broberg and Barron trade is possible too. Right-handed defenders who can play on the top 2 pairings are highly sought after, Mitchell writes. Perhaps Mitchell should be reminded that the Canadiens and Sens also need help on the right side of defense, not really the left. And so, with this idea in mind, the Athletic piece proposes a Justin Barron for Philip Broberg trade. And this is one of those things where, when I think about the assets themselves, isolated, not considering the teams, not talking about their projection in the lineup and what their roles are with their squads, when I think about just Broberg and Barron, I think this would be a really big win for the Montreal Canadiens. Now, that's not to disrespect Justin Barron, but when it comes to Philip Broberg, this is a guy whom, even though I said all those years ago he was drafted a little bit too high, 8th overall in 2019, this was a guy who had all the tools but not the tool set. He didn't really have the brains to be able to process the game at high speeds, despite the fact that he was one of the best skaters in the NHL draft that year, alongside of like Jack Hughes and Alex Newhook and Peyton Krebs. Philip Broberg was still, at his best, a puck-rushing, offensively minded defenseman, and he had showed that off in the 2024 Stanley Cup Playoffs as well. He had 3 points in 10 games played for the Oilers, but 2 of those points came in games in the Stanley Cup Final, including a goal he had scored in the Oilers' 4-3 loss on home ice against the Florida Panthers. Broberg actually was very useful in that series, and we started to see that there was more to him as an NHL-caliber defenseman than we had initially believed. His development kind of staggered around in the AHL for a few years, and people were asking, okay, when is this guy going to be able to break out? And you could say that even though he didn't necessarily do that this season, he still spent the majority of his time in the American Hockey League. This is still a player who, at the end of the day, has all the tools to become a super effective, mobile, fluid skating, dashing like the wind, offensively minded guy. Now, sure, the hockey brains is really gonna need to improve if he wants to do that at the NHL level full-time, but there's a reason he was taken so high in the draft anyway. I remember even a few years ago we made a video about Philip Broberg talking about how he was compared to Victor Hedman by Victor Hedman. And that certainly is not a comparison that I personally would use. I don't think Victor Hedman when I think of Philip Broberg and his best potential, but it's the name that Victor Hedman himself said. He's like, yeah, he kind of plays like me. So, while I'm not going to say definitively that Broberg is going to be the next Victor Hedman, he's going to win Norris trophies and Conn Smythes, and he's going to do all this, I'm not going to say that. Did Hedman even win the Conn Smythe? I don't remember. It was so long ago. But really, this is a guy who has potential. And when I think about what Justin Barron could be on the opposite side of things, I think Barron maxes out maybe as a middle four-ish caliber defenseman who's got some mobility, who can be a number 2 power play guy, and who maybe maxes out at 35 to 40 points in a year. I think that Broberg has a much higher offensive output ceiling than Barron, but also there's more uncertainty there. And unfortunately, when it comes to the Canadiens, they have so many bodies that I feel like a little bit of uncertainty could be seen as a good thing. Hey, there are so many guys that do exist on the Canadiens roster, so why not just scramble around the names with the guys who have the most potential? What's the use of getting a whole bunch of guys who could max out as middle to bottom 4 pairing defensemen when you could get one guy instead who could be a top 2 if everything works out? For me personally, I like the idea of Broberg for Barron, but I will say it does kind of clog things up. Like, let's say that Philip Broberg becomes the best version of himself in Montreal. What do you do then? You're going to have Cayden Gooley as your left-handed guy, number 1, number 2. Lane Hudson is going to be your other guy, number 1, number 2. And then you're forced to run with a Broberg on third pairing minutes? Maybe he gets a bigger power play role, who really knows, but you're not going to take away power play time from Lane Hudson. Also, there's going to be Jordan Harris, there's going to be Jayden Struble, there are going to be a bunch of other guys who can play left, so you're going to have to automatically force one of them to the right side, where you're probably also going to have Reinbacher and Mailloux. It's an age-old debate talking about the Canadiens and how many gosh darn defensemen they have, and a defenseman for defenseman swap doesn't necessarily change that in any way. It gives Edmonton the support they would like on the bottom right side of their defense because Justin Barron is a fine hockey player who does have potential to grow and still become better. But at the end of the day, I don't think this trade really is one that the Canadiens can look at and be like, yeah, this will give us a really big benefit for our team that is 8 times out of 10 going to hit. Like, they're upgrading the quality of the asset they have, sure, but it doesn't really fix anything because there still is some uncertainty with the rest of the decor. Either way, if you're asking me, like, do the Canadiens make this trade? Do they not? If it were up to me, I'd say yeah. I do think that improving the quality of your assets is a good move, even if there is some sort of a logjam that could be built up because of it. I mean, it's not like the logjam wasn't there regardless, right? But either way, Philip Broberg is a guy whom I've had such an interesting time talking about in these YouTube videos over the past few years, so to see him go from top prospect to eventual trade chip to a Stanley Cup finalist shower-upper, a guy who scored some pretty notable points in the final series, and then maybe become a Montreal Canadien afterwards, it could be like the Lane Hudson-Kulak trade all over again. So, if you're an Oilers fan, if you are a Canadiens fan, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about the idea of a Justin Barron for Philip Broberg trade. If the Oilers are so intent on making the Stanley Cup playoffs and winning the cup right now, I'm sorry, but Philip Broberg is not going to be like the biggest needle mover in the world. I know he'd scored some points in the final series, but if everything works out for Edmonton, Philip Broberg is not on the team. In fact, if you wanted to say that Broberg coming in for relief was like more of a desperation thing, then that makes sense. It's just, you had Desharnais, he wasn't really living up to what he needed to do, and you had to swap some guys around. There are some extra names there. Now, when you think about Justin Barron on the right side, does this make sense as a potential replacement for you heading into the 2024-2025 season? And if you make the playoffs, do you think Justin Barron is a more reliable option on the right side compared to a Broberg who would be played on the left side and then he'd have to move everybody else around and everything? So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Oilers fans and Canadiens fans, how do you feel about the idea of Barron for Broberg? I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.